Hi, welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks for joining me. Have you ever had an experience where you shared something with somebody or maybe participated in a relatively large group of people and found sometimes maybe immediately afterwards or in the day or two following that you feel this really kind of intense sense of shame or the desire to run away? Yeah, I know I've felt that. Well, you're not alone, and there's a reason that that happens. And today I want to talk about why that happens, but also what to do when it happens, because there's healing that can happen through that. I know it doesn't feel like it in the moment, but there really is healing that can happen. That can be a practice of healing. So I'm talking about this today because I just started my new group and we had our first call. And it was a large group of people, and people shared so beautifully, powerfully, openly. I was quite impressed actually, but because it's not easy, right? But I ended up saying towards the end of that video that they might notice kind of struggling a little bit afterwards. And if you follow Brene Brown, she refers to it as a vulnerability hangover. I don't typically name things like that, but I think it's a really interesting way to think about it because I would definitely agree with that. Some people might refer to it as a shame attack. Whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really matter. But what's happening in that moment does matter. And that's what I want to talk about. So when you share something, and it could be just with a friend, but when you share something or open yourself up in a way that feels really vulnerable, so even just if you think back to being in school and raising your hand, like for a lot of you, you probably didn't raise your hand. I know I wasn't one that would raise my hand. But even something like just raising your hand to answer a question, even a relatively simple question, that creates vulnerability because as you raise your hand, people are going to look at you. And when people look at you, they are seeing you. When you speak, when you're using your voice, people are going to pay attention. And for people who have spent their lives trying to hide, to be safe, to keep quiet, to feel safe and or to not feel ashamed, when you start speaking or showing up, it's incredibly vulnerable. And part of the reason that you likely haven't been showing up really vulnerably or authentically, because a lot of people will show up in big and boisterous ways, but that's not really them that they're showing to the world. It's this persona, this mask even. But when we show up in a way that is vulnerable and authentic, we are basically like bearing our souls in a sense, even if it's something pretty minor. Because when we're not used to it, it feels just as scary as if we truly are bearing our soul, like walking out in public naked or something like that. When that happens, oftentimes shame comes up. The fear of being seen comes up. And that, along with shame, often go together because shame is often about, in part, worrying that somebody is going to see that thing that we are ashamed of, that they're going to see us in the same way that we see us. So whether it's raising your hand in school, sharing personal things with a friend, or sharing your opinion in a broader context, that creates vulnerability. And that's true for everybody. Some people feel vulnerability differently than others. For some, it's like brings up a lot of shame and fear. For some, it's kind of like this little bit of an adrenaline rush. But either way, it's vulnerable. And when you feel vulnerable, that self-protective mechanism kicks in. because it doesn't want you to feel vulnerable, because vulnerable feels scary and unsafe. So that self-protective mechanism kicks in and tells you, don't ever do that again. What were you thinking? Are you crazy? Nobody wants to hear that. Why would you share that? Look at you. What have you done? Sound familiar? When that happens, you believe that. You believe what you're saying to yourself in your mind in those moments, whether you're consciously aware of what you're saying or not. You might just feel. You may not be aware of the thoughts going through your mind, the thoughts that are reinforcing those core beliefs. And when those feelings come up, because again, shame is often attached to that, the desire is to pull away, to not be visible, to not see that person again, because you fear on some level the judgment, the thoughts of what that person might have about you. And so we can pull away, we can push away, we isolate because it feels too vulnerable and risky to allow ourselves to interact with anybody. But that is about the worst thing that you can do in those moments. This is something that I talk with my individual clients about a lot, because they often are sharing things that are vulnerable, sharing things for the first time. And often afterwards, there is a desire to pull back. They can feel filled with shame and have a lot of self-doubt and self-loathing come to the surface. And the desire then is to pull back and isolate. But when you do that, when you pull back and isolate, you are reinforcing that you are not worthy of being seen. You're reinforcing that fear that you have about being seen is warranted. That you are wrong in sharing or showing up. But that's not true. But when you isolate, when you pull back and you don't re-engage, then you're left with being able to believe that because you have nothing to prove otherwise. And if somebody doesn't reach out to you like you shared with a friend and they don't reach out to you immediately, you're going to take that as proof that, oh my God, they think I'm a horrible person and now they don't want to talk to me anymore. Sound familiar? That's not true. That isn't really what's happening. But because you're closing yourself off to anything that can show you something different in that moment, those core beliefs are going to kick in and try to remind you of that lie. So the more you pull back, the more you believe that. The more you believe that you shouldn't have shared, that you shouldn't have shown up, that you're crazy for thinking it would ever be a good idea. So, what do you do? Well, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that that is a pretty normal response. It really is, even for people that don't have any sort of trauma history. Being seen is not easy. We are taught to hide. We're taught to not be real, especially in the era of social media, to only let people see the good things, the things that are fitting in with other people, the things that make us geniuses and gurus and whatever. That actually leads to more shame, but that's another topic. But the only way that we can really ever truly feel connected to another human being is if we allow them in without the mask. So when we feel that vulnerability, when we are questioning, what the hell have I done? the hell is wrong with you for thinking that you should do this? Notice that you're having those thoughts. Remind yourself, okay, this is just the normal process. This isn't true. This is my fear speaking. This is the shame speaking. So, who can I reach out to? What can I do to feel a sense of connection or belonging? What can I do to help me see that it's okay to show up? And it doesn't mean that you have to show up with that same person, although that can be good. It doesn't mean that you have to show up and share the same things again. Not at all. It just means that with awareness, you show up with somebody where you feel like you can be authentic. Just be yourself. That's it. Simple in theory, because that is really it. Just showing up as yourself. But showing up as ourselves is not easy. Everything around us from childhood tells us that it's not really okay to always show up as ourselves. And that's true for almost all cultures, if not all. But the more we practice that, the more we practice leaning into vulnerability, to sharing an opinion. It doesn't have to be something really personal and painful. Just an opinion. That feels scary a lot of times, right? But the more we practice that and we don't pull back and isolate afterwards, that is a healing practice. There is literally healing happening in those moments. You are taking steps up that mountain every time you do that. When you show up in some way or share in some way and you pull back and isolate, you've still taken a couple of steps up that mountain. But then what happens when you isolate is you decide it's too scary to go any further. It's like you have this nightmare about what is in store for you the next day, and you hold on to that as true. So you tell yourself, okay, this is as far as I can go. I can't go any further. So you hold yourself back in that way. But if you can trust that maybe it was just a dream, just a horrible nightmare, or you can trust the guide that is helping you navigate that, maybe even lean into trusting yourself and your worthiness, then you see that that horrible nightmare was just that. It wasn't a premonition. It wasn't the truth of what is happening in your current life. It feels scary for me when I put myself out there, not so much now, but, well, earlier in my life, I never would have put myself out there in any way. But when even in school, like in college, I didn't raise my hand. I was too afraid of getting it wrong. And then that would prove what I believed about myself, because one of my core beliefs is that I was not smart. In fact, the word I used all the time was stupid. And even if I thought that I was pretty sure that the answer was correct, I wouldn't raise my hand. Because if I got it wrong, then that would be all the proof that I would need. And not only would it be proof that I was stupid, but then everybody else would know that too. We hold ourselves back in so many ways because we fear being seen. Like I said, even with a simple opinion. But that's the thing about vulnerability, is that whether it's a simple opinion about something or something much more kind of significant in terms of what we're sharing or how we're showing up, when we feel that vulnerability, that fear inside of us, it kind of doesn't have a gauge, like, okay, this is how vulnerable I should feel over here, and this is how vulnerable I should feel over here. It's like this intense experience of vulnerability. And that's why we have to practice, so that we can have the experience of knowing that it can be okay, even when we are filled with that shame or self-doubt. As long as we don't isolate, we can recognize, we can retrain our nervous system, the response in our body, to know that that vulnerability does not have to equal something being really bad. That shame that comes up isn't coming up because there's something to be ashamed of. That's just your learned response and your fear. Can you relate to any of this? How often does this show up in your life? You're not alone. Share in the comments. This is something we all have experience with. And it is important to understand what's happening and practice. Not isolating. Practice reconnecting, so that you can learn in your body and in your mind and in your heart that you can show up, that the people around you want you to show up. They appreciate you sharing with them. Thanks for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.